2026 is going to be a year where people might disengage from social media. They might find ways to make their phones into bricks, Gen Z or Gen Alpha going to, Nokia's or the equivalent today. So there's something about we have leaned so much into convenience and ease and friction free that we've almost kind of sleepwalked into a world we might not recognize anymore.
Most tech conversations start with how to build, how to scale, how to grow. I'm more interested in why. Why should this exist? Why does it matter? Why are we building this now? I'm Tom Horak, and this is Changing Shapes, a podcast where I sit down with people who are shaping culture through technology in order to discuss the reason underneath. The way we're learning now is changing. AI can do so much for us, so how is that changing education? In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Khairunnisa Mohamedali. She's a PhD anthropologist and Chief Innovation Officer and MD at the Smarty Train. The Smarty Train is an award-winning agency that uses psychology and creative design to build immersive learning, onboarding, and development programs. We covered a lot of ground: how AI is changing the value of struggle, why convenience might be making us worse at thinking, and the difference between inclusion and belonging. Hello, and welcome to the Changing Shapes podcast. Dr. Mohamedali, it's so great to have you on and so excited to talk to you. There's so many different topics we can dive into.
Absolutely, and delighted to be here today, Thomas. I am an MD, Chief Innovation Officer, currently at the Smarty Train. And to give a bit of context on me, so my background is I have a PhD, social scientist, anthropologist by training, moved from the world of academia to innovation. And now I'm in the world of learning, development, and behavior change. And really what I do is bring together human-centered design with a whole deep, rigorous understanding of people, the science behind how we work, how we behave, and a bit of creativity to make things interesting, of course. So that's me. And my role and what I do ultimately in my day-to-day is how is it that we can really help people grow in their roles in organizations? How can we help shift cultures? Organizational culture? How can we shift almost like large-scale people behavior in businesses, especially currently when there's so much change happening that a lot of organizations have to be a lot more agile, not only in how they formulate and execute on their strategy, but how they bring their people on the journey to kind of be the boots on the ground to make that strategy happen.
So diving straight into it, I'd want to talk a little bit about AI and education. And I know that you've spoken about making learning sticky, which is really important. And what we strive, as a parent, I'm striving for our son to get into learning and to love it and to have sort of a lifelong experience with learning. I think, you hinted at this, that we're going through a lot of changes. So on the one hand, with LLMs and generative AI, we can make research and information really interactive. So it's such a great tool that we can use to either query and interact and communicate with information. We can turn research papers into a podcast or a chat bot. We can get quizzed by it. We could even, I was recently heard somebody made a complex topic, they turned it into a Taylor Swift song so that they could memorize the information better, which is such a fun way to learn, and we can kind of adjust it to what works for us in our learning patterns. At the same time, we can use an LLM to draft an essay at a professor level and can kind of skip ahead and maybe not do the hard work that is important within learning. How do you see generative AI helping make learning sticky? And are there particular groups that you think benefit the most from these innovations?
It's a great question and a very big one, and one that obviously we're grappling with a fair amount because there's so much potential in what we can do with generative AI, but we're very much in the discovery phase of understanding what works and what doesn't, and most importantly, what's good and what's not. And in some ways, when we look at how we, I guess, traditionally learn, although I don't like that word, it's that when we're new at something, we don't always know what we're good at and not good at, and we don't know what good looks like. And you get reinforcement externally to tell you, this is good, this is not good, this is working, this is not working. With Gen AI, the challenge we're seeing is that often you might not get, unless it's baked into the model, the feedback in the right way that you're not doing something, especially using the more, regular models, because it's all about reinforcing what you're doing, playing it back to you, being quite gentle in some ways. And so I think that there's that risk there that we're not necessarily getting the honest feedback, if you will, on what we're learning and not learning, what we're doing and not doing well. So I think that's one thing to think about. And I can give the example, you talked about your son. So I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. and my 7-year-old was trying to find a craft to do. So he took pictures of like these pom-poms and pipe cleaners he had, and he asked ChatGPT in voice mode. He was like, give me an idea for what I can make with this that's simple and quick. And he was having a conversation, and the AI was saying, make a football with the pom-pom. And I'm looking at the pom-poms thinking they're not big enough to make that happen, but is he going to be able to figure this out? So I kind of let him go through that process because it's a safe space for him to learn. And my 5-year-old comes to me and he goes, who's he talking to? How is he talking to that? So I was like, okay. So it's just this whole can of worms that opens up if we think about children. But I think even as like obviously fully formed adults, when we're working with this, it's a new tool that we're still kind of figuring out, how do we navigate this? What does it look like? And one of the things we're finding in clients we work with is that a lot of learning on how to use AI centers on almost the technical using of it, not how to think about how you work with AI and therefore what you need to put into it and what you get out of it. So I think that's almost the preamble to, there's so much great stuff we could do with generative AI when it comes to learning, but there's also this risk that we're still not quite figuring out yet and figuring out the measures of actually the boundaries of what's good, what's not good. I will say that one of the things we're seeing is that, and I think you'll see this as well, it's kind of being written out about a fair amount, is that there was so much enthusiasm in using Gen AI initially. And we all kind of, many people, I think there's obviously a range, skeptics, enthusiasts, curious. But many of us kind of, you dive into it head first, you start using it and you're like, this is great, my life's easy. And then you reach a point where like, hold on a second though, am I just doing more, but it's less good? Is this working? And I think we're at a reckoning moment right now. And it's a really good place to be because we've gone from let's do this to hold on, how do we do this well?
That's a really good point. And I'm noticing kind of that part of the cycle where we're sort of engaging with it. How are we actually technically using these tools and questioning, because I think the novelty aspect of it's just giving me all these things for free and it's coming so easily, finally, luckily, is wearing off. And now we're kind of figuring out how to make it give us that right element of feedback. Yeah. So kind of learning what are these tools. And I think it's interesting you make that parallel. Our son is 4.5, and I always am quite wary of engaging with these tools in front of him because it's so anthropomorphized and it sounds like a human. So who are you talking to? And where he does witness it is if I'm driving and I want to put on one of his stories, I will ask Siri or Google to put on a story for him, and I kind of need to explain to him, well, it's a robot, it's not a person, because even though it sounds like one. And I think for us, we're kind of going through a parallel with that, where it feels so human, it feels so perfect because it writes in full sentences and it creates something new. And to actually come to the point of second guessing, how do we make it give us the right bit of information? But do you think if we are able to do that, to kind of give them the right level of instructions to help us, is there a shift with what we should be learning and the sort of ROI of studying? Because assuming we have a sort of a trained LLM and good instructions to just give us very good information and tell us where the blind spots are, not make things up. It's almost a different level of access to information than just Googling something. Does that change what we should be learning and the skills that we should kind of bring to the table in education?
It's a good point. And the short answer is I think so. What that is, TBD. But let's assume it's perfect. Let's assume that it is nailing the information, it's fact-checking everything, it's accurate, it's giving the right level of nuance in the response information, it can give us sources. Let's assume it's great at all that stuff, which we know it's not yet, but let's assume it is. I think we need to be mindful first in using it that we keep honing our own critical thinking and evaluation skills. Because there's an analogy that I find effective. I think it works, which is if you think about it, when maybe cars first came out, we all kind of had to know how to change the oil. We had to know the basics. When you learn to drive, you learned those basics. Cars became electric and they're just fancy computers right now. And so you can't really do as much to sort things out as you used to be able to. You have to go and get it plugged into a computer. And we've lost the skill of understanding our vehicles as much as we used to. So when tools come that make our lives easier, I think we have a tendency to embrace the convenience of it. And why would we invest cognitive space knowing something we don't need to know? And I think if AI is doing all that for us, it's almost the sort of most intellectual, clever friend in pocket, the Cyrano de Bergerac type talking in the ear. Why would we spend the time learning that versus just executing what it's telling us to do? So I think that's just a careful line to cross and make sure that we stay on the right side of to develop that critical thinking. That said, we're working with a number of clients and conversations we're having where they're looking at the entry point into the job market. So a graduate, a school leaver coming into the workforce. Historically, you would go into learning at that organization and you would get the basic skills and you would grow those through. AI can do a lot of those basic skills right now. The question is, in an ideal world, we're outsourcing all of that base level to AI and people are doing the higher order thinking. But then the question always is, how do you get and develop your ability to the higher order thinking if you've not done the base level? And is there a place where you can be taught in an accelerated way using AI and other tools to get the base level, to get that critical thinking? Or actually, are you just thrown in and you figure it out and that's the way to do it? Learn by truly doing. So I think there's something about the physical, I guess, spaces we learn in, the ways that we see people do what they do, that we figure things out versus, say, having a conversation about what this means, right? The theory to practice kind of shift is something we need to think hard about. So I think there's something about really being able to, in our work with people who are new joiners to the workforce, early careers as we call them, how can we get them learning in the right way, knowing that there's not going to be roles for that task-based work like there used to be in the past. And the role, therefore, of education and universities really does have to shift, because if you're able to, say, perfect world, write the best possible essay on, Plato or systems coding or whatever it might be at the university level, does that equal to actually knowing what you're doing and being able to do it?
Yeah, and I can really see, just getting that essay written for me, I didn't really go through the journey of learning about Plato if it just exists. And I think there is an element of that friction of having to write something like that is beneficial for me. And I wonder, as you were talking about it, if there's a change in how we do education and critical thinking to a degree, because in a way, we've been spoiled until now, because the things we've read before LLMs had to go through some kind of a frictionful process where, if it's a book, not everybody can just write a book and get to a publisher and have it printed. You have to go through hoops of people critiquing it, getting something for other people to read. Will have had to go through steps where others were also adding that critical thinking. So I'm already delivered something that's been proofed in many ways. I'm much more sort of critical of, did this go through that process or did it just appear out of nowhere, which means that there might be a different level of quality there.
The ability to know, as you said, to apply that critical lens, but almost to have your mental shortcuts to know this is something that this is legit, this is not. Here are the clues, here are the signs I'm seeing. So we almost become sifters of truth or validity. If I think it, my own education. So I started out and I did a minor in philosophy. And I think that's the most useful thing I did, because philosophy is basically logic. And it's being really critical in a very systematic way about what makes an idea or a thought or a concept good and valid versus not. And I think that should be foundational, because when we move into places where we're so far removed from, as you said, knowing or working through that frictionful process of content, like the work's not being done for us, we have to do the work. If writing a, essay on Plato with ChatGPT versus on your own, and how we change how we work in education. I was talking to a professor at a well-known British university, and she was saying that when you grade papers that are written, there's a few things you look at, and she would look at, one of them was sources. And she found, though, with AI, that a lot of papers were coming her way that had a whole lot of words, but not a lot of meaning. And she would look at the sources, and oftentimes the sources would be legit. They'd be the right ones you should cite. So the AI had figured out that these are the sources that answer this question. And then when she's grading a paper one day and she looked at the sources and there was a paper attributed to her, she'd never written it. And it was in the citations. And so it had actually said, these are the names that need to be there. And then it fabricated a source to justify a piece up there. And I think for universities to teach that critical lens, there's some universities we work with, we speak with, who have a system where I think it's getting more and more common, where it's like, here you can and should use AI. In fact, you must use it here. You can choose to use it here and you cannot use it here. And it's determined based on where do they need students to learn how to use it effectively. but also where are some skills being taught that they need to go through that painful, frictionful process of learning that can't be outsourced to build that, cognitive capacity and the skill. So that's an interesting approach when it comes to seeing it not only as a tool for learning, but something that needs to be itself learned about, as it were.
That's really interesting. And I wonder if there's a shift in students today to actually yearn more for that, right? It was not just about, I need to deliver this and get my grades, but actually I'm doing this in order to train that. And maybe double tapping on good friction. And I mean, for me, that's always an interesting point in terms of designing products, whereas, you want to make things seamless, but also at some points you do want to have some friction. And I really liked, I was reading a quote from you on your masterclass on learning where you said, make it theirs, make it short, make it visual. And I think that really resonated with what I believe in product design as well. But at the same time, we love efficiency in tech, but a PhD is the opposite of frictionless, probably as far away from frictionless as you can get. And I always grapple with that dichotomy of don't make me think versus the value of a productive struggle. When is friction valuable, and how do you decide where to keep it? Where is it just a pain that would be better left on the side?
It's a really good question. I think when it comes to learning, you have a certain amount of cognitive effort that you're going to spend on something. And you want that cognitive effort to be really focused in on the place where that learning itself happens. The rest of it needs to be straightforward and simple. So if I'm thinking about, say, digital products for learning, or even a face-to-face experience or, doing something, you want the process of joining, of knowing what you're supposed to do, knowing what's expected of you. You want all of that to be as easy as possible. You want that to be easy so that you can then focus in on where that learning moment actually happens. And we often, we're in an organization and they're like, this is the invite process and you have to click on 3 links to sign up. If you think about the journey that your user is going through from a learning perspective, and you're like, where do we want them? Should it be easy? So they're looking forward to this. It's easy, it's simple, excited. They come there ready, and then they're focused on that moment. The other flip side of it, or rather related, is that learning is fundamentally moving through discomfort, right? Because you are not going to be good at something, or it's going to be hard, it's going to be weird, and you need to be okay and in fact embrace that. And oftentimes the way I see it, and the way we see it at the Smarty Train, is if you're uncomfortable, you're probably actually in a place where you're realizing you need to learn something, or you are currently trying something in the process of learning it, and you're not doing it super well, but you're going to get there eventually. Friction does need to be there because you also need people to pay attention. And if everything is super simple, like I said, convenience, I can pick up my phone, order something, it's on my doorstep in 2 hours. That's very easy. I'm not thinking about it. If something is hard, I'm thinking about it. But you want that difficulty to come, that friction in the right place. So discomfort is necessary. Friction is almost like a tool in how you design. And then everything else is straightforward. We have, a very transdisciplinary team here, and we have some strategists, foresight strategists, who look at what are future trends so we can understand how's the skills landscape, the market, the industry, the world shifting, evolving, because especially when it comes to new joiners to the workforce, you need to think about future skills, not just current skills. But that's the same for every organization. And one of the things we're looking at is a potential shift away from convenience. We know when you had tech first come out, smartphones, a few years later, you had the whole digital detox trend begin. And people were like, I want to shut off. By some estimations, 2026 is going to be a year where people might disengage from social media. They might find ways to make their phones into bricks, Gen Z or Gen Alpha going to, Nokia's or the equivalent today. So there's something about, we have leaned so much into convenience and ease and friction-free that we've almost kind of sleepwalked into a world we might not recognize anymore. And there's potentially going to be a response, or at least a movement towards things shouldn't always be easy. So I think there's some larger shifts that might be happening that could be quite interesting. And wouldn't it be interesting, fascinating, in fact, if we said, maybe let's not prioritize convenience and ease as much. Let's really think about where we should make things difficult for ourselves because we need to have that, reckoning almost.
I'm going to quote you to our 4-year-old because, he's at the point where he's learning that, sometimes hard things are actually good. And I think it's so fascinating watching him and finding the ways how to motivate him to push through things. And One of my favorite moments was when, with his first Lego, the Lego was really hard for him because it was his first one. And he kept getting frustrated walking away, but then he'd come back because he really actually wants to build it. And that was the perfect loop of immense frustration of learning something, but having this draw to come into it. What are your methods for either for yourself or if somebody asks you, again, I'm sure going through, writing your PhD, there were a lot of moments where that friction must have been very tough.
So one is tying to what we were talking about earlier is almost building the system around you. So if we think about like learning journeys, everything is easy, but the friction points are where you really do need to invest that, have those uncomfortable moments. I think it's the same thing. Like when I was doing my PhD, to go back to that, it was frictionful, it was challenging, but I would do things around it that I'd be like, this is my ease, this is my joy, and this is where I'm just kind to myself and I'm letting it go. So if I have to finish this dissertation, so I'm going to write 2,500 words a day, because I read somewhere that Stephen King wrote that. And I was like, you know what? Fine. I'll just take that as my measure. I'll write those many words a day. And even if they're not good, doesn't matter. I'm going to get to where I need to get to because I'll do a refinement subsequently. It's really hard to sit down and write that many words in a day. I would start out the day and I would like work out for an hour. I would write those words and I would just play video games in the evening or go out. So you almost need to think about the system you're engineering when it comes into the world of work and you can't operate by your own schedule as much. You need to work by the schedule that's given to you in some ways, although there's obviously always flexibility in the workplace, hopefully. It's thinking about if you were to map out your day, your week, where are those intense periods coming? What are the days where you're like, actually, I'm not really going to be able to invest much more in cognitive effort or frictionful experiences? Let those days go and focus on those places where you have the bandwidth to do it. That leads to the second point, which learning ultimately, what is it but just growing, doing things differently, becoming your better self in a way of I'm going to be a better, say, communicator. I'm going to be better at writing this language. I'm going to be better at whatever it is. If learning is growth is, as we talked about, there's going to be discomfort around it, right? Because there are things you're unfamiliar with. So self-awareness is really critical. So being able to recognize when you're encountering those uncomfortable moments and how you feel in them so you can manage your way through them and manage yourself ultimately through those as well. I think sometimes historically or in academia, at least learning is an intellectual exercise. But I think really in the world, learning is a very tangible, felt thing. And understanding yourself, what works for you, what doesn't, how you respond. I know that if I've had days where I've had to do something quite out of my comfort zone, then I'm a bit more impatient. And so then I need to actually take a few breaths, and because having a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, again, very obviously tricky and challenging. So I'm like, okay, I need to really manage myself now, but then I'm going to do this to kind of come down from it. Self-awareness is an under-invested in skill, and most of us are terrible at it because we don't spend the time really doing it.
Do you have a takeaway for listeners who are either building learning cultures or future-proofing careers based on what you're seeing? What kind of advice would you or have a takeaway for people in those positions?
One of the most powerful things you can do when it comes to designing a learning experience, thinking about how you build a culture in your organization, move something through to execution, is to really think about your audience, your user, and where they're coming from. Being able to put yourself in their shoes, which is the most basic way of putting it, in a really meaningful, intentional way. Oftentimes, when we work with organizations, there's such a necessary push and imperative to teach certain skills or get certain outcomes. But actually, how is what you're trying to achieve, how is that actually coming to life on the ground? And how are people going to receive it? Where are they in their day, in their career, in their week, whatever it might be? What's happening in the business more widely? And I think thinking about that and then connecting the learning to that day-to-day is the most important thing you can do. And not a theoretical connection. We talked about that felt part of learning. It's like an actual connection to what they are physically, intellectually, actually doing in their day, so they can translate the learning quite quickly into practice. I think that's critical. When it comes to navigating your career, right now, change is happening at a much more accelerated pace. Technology adoption, strategies are changing a lot more often. There's bigger question marks on core skills that are needed, and a lot more work to kind of systematize those with the technology we now have in an organization. So I would say if you're navigating your career, a flexibility or an agility is a really important mindset to have, because I don't think that we're going to necessarily keep moving down set career paths for vast majority of people in their roles and where they're going, because we don't even know what future roles are going to look like at this point. They might not shift, but they might well shift drastically. So I think that flexibility and that openness is quite important, and being able to not just, I'm okay with this, but actually I see opportunity in this is the mindset that's quite critical.
I was also fascinated by your work on belonging, and in the context of work is around onboarding, but I think belonging is a more extended thing. It's not just within onboarding, it's in any cultural situation. I've personally experienced that a lot in my life. What I really liked about what I read from you was the difference between inclusion and belonging. And I think that difference is a nuance that is often forgotten. And I like that you noted that periods of transitions are times of liminality and moments where that belonging is shaped. And I've experienced that in good ways and also in maybe not so good ways. And I was wondering, as I was kind of reading through some of the things that you wrote about that, where do you see our current moment in work culture or generally in culture in this regard? I do feel there's a big shift in the last, 5 years? And also, how do you help people who've never really felt excluded understand that experience and maybe to change their behavior as a point of allowing for that level of inclusion when sort of new shift into different places?
Yeah, it's an interesting one in terms of the second point of how can you get folks who've not felt exclusion? And there's two ways to answer that. And it kind of goes back a little bit to the self-awareness point in the end, what your answer would be or which route you take. First is people might not have felt exclusion with like a capital E in terms of identity-based exclusion, right? And I think if you're, like me, a woman, person of color, whatever it might be, immigrant, then you feel exclusion in the big way. When you go somewhere new, when you're in a different kind of group, etc. But I feel like most people have felt exclusion with a small e at some point, right? And that is the simple feeling of not feeling like you know your way or how to navigate a situation or what the code is. And I think a simple example would be, when you're a kid and you're just picked last for a team, or it's these little things that happen that are not the big exclusion, but they're the small. And I think the feeling is similar. It's nothing similar in scale, but just the type, that thing you feel in you. And I think making that connection of what that is a very human emotion. And I think that can be something that kind of lowers barriers. In the work that we do on building inclusivity amongst leaders or a sense of belonging in organizations, the first step is often the disarming and the removing of the defensiveness, because it can be hard to hear that the things you're doing lead someone to feel like they don't have a part, they don't belong. Because oftentimes we are driven by not malice, but by just unconscious bias, if you want to call it that, but the ways we're programmed to just have in-group, out-group. And the research validates it, right? You are much more likely to mirror the body language of someone in a meeting if they look like you. These are things that, again, you can move through, be aware of, but that's also hard. So systems can help address, that belonging and exclusion, etc. But the key thing is, I think, connecting with that feeling, disarming it is quite important as well. And I think we've entered a space where a lot of the discourse is almost finger pointy, and it's created bigger and bigger divides. And I think that bridging point is quite important fundamentally, because all of us have many identities in us. And oftentimes, who we are, where we're born, the language we speak, whatever, it determines so much of our, unfortunately, life outcomes or experiences. And I think, again, all data, science backed, whatever. But the reality is you cannot change people's minds about stuff. You cannot change opinions by talking fact. You have to connect, build that bridge, and speak emotion ultimately. So I think there's something in how these conversations are had and the entry point to it that are critical. I also think that first point, of course, is big E exclusion, small E exclusion is different. The second way is to think about as an individual who is, I want to understand this better and be more inclusive or create spaces where it feels like they belong because it matters to me. I just want this to be a more humane environment for everybody to work in. It's training yourself to really observe a lot more your own behaviors and the behaviors of people around you that you wouldn't otherwise pay attention to. So you can tie into someone and you can point out that exclusion, or you could actually, if they're self-motivated, if you want to call it, kind of build that observation into what you do, because we're all human. We share so many experiences just in different ways.
One thing that I also thought about while you were speaking was also that just purely the cross-generational experience. You're coming from a different place with what you've grown up with, the time you grew up with, not even just the place. And it's so fascinating to hear your perspective, because you see so many different levels on age, on different businesses, and you're in such a unique position to see where our culture with work and education currently is, and that sort of sense of the pulse of where we are culturally.
And we have a tendency to anthropomorphize everything. We're just made to see. We take random facts and our brain makes a story out of it, and we see a random object and our brain sees a personality. I always think of the Pixar light lamp as a good example. It's a lamp, but we see so much emotion in that 3-second little blip at the start, little video at the start of movies, that we feel connected to that lamp. So we have a tendency to do this, and let alone when AI is responding to us in a very human way, to the point where you can pick the voice you like, you can train it to respond to you in the way you like. So it's not just being human, it's being human in the exact way that you want it to be. And to go back to the conversation about being easy and convenient, we're all able to make our perfect thing if we wanted to, and perfect to us only. But that doesn't mean it's good for us. We do best as humans when we encounter people who are different from us, that force us to re-examine our own view of the world and our own experiences. And being tempted by the ease of a Gen AI that gives you what you need, A, we're likely to be fooled quite easily, so to speak, but B, we are likely to fall into just hearing what we want to hear, confirming what we want to confirm, and not being pushed and challenged. And I think that's something we shouldn't lose.
You sound quite optimistic, because I think the view that it is so easy to do that can very easily, one can become cynical that as a sort of species, we're doomed now, because will just fall into this incredible, unprecedented level of convenience and comfort. But you sound pretty optimistic that we won't.
I will say that I think optimism is a personality trait for me, which has served me very well. But I will also say that, and again, past, things that have happened in the past are no guarantee of any future. And we could well be going into all kinds of dystopian. But I think we underestimate how much we rise to the occasion to challenge and shift things. And if we look at the course of the long arc of history, there's been a lot of negative, a lot of challenge, but so much positive, right? And if you look at the stats out there, there's way less global poverty, way more women are in jobs, more people are educated, more people are literate. Health outcomes are better. Is it great everywhere? No, we just have visibility into all the horrible things. And our brains, according to research, at least, for every one negative thing, we need 5 positive things to happen to balance out our sense that things are okay. So we're wired to maybe see things a little badly, is how I see it, which again, I'm optimistic by nature. But the second thing is a lot of bad things have happened. We're still here. And I think we're quite resilient as a species. It may not be the optimal. We'll find our way through in a way that works for us. And I think the key thing, though, is we can't assume that's going to happen. And I think that's where the imperative to learn, to grow ourselves, to be critical, to hold ourselves accountable becomes quite critical. And I think if I can hold myself accountable, then hopefully that's good enough for me.
That's really inspiring. And I think that's the perfect place to end this really great conversation. Thank you so much. This was absolute joy. I've learned a lot from you, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.